Hey everyone, check out this prop I've got here today. You probably already know what it is. It's an M4. It's not much to look at, pretty visually uninteresting, and it's certainly far from being the strongest rifle ever. But what firearm enthusiasts would definitely tell you is although the M4 can perform its rifleman's job well, what it really excels at is how easily you can customize it to the point where it's almost unrecognizable. Not just add-on parts. I'm talking customizations that let the rifle do things way outside the performance margins of the original design. Now, if you don't know where I'm going with this analogy, my point is, a simple design can accomplish much more than what was originally asked, just like the aircraft we have here today. Roll the intro, Jimbo. Before we get into it though, welcome to the Minnesota wing of the Commemorative Air Force. Being indoors is nice, don't you think? No 18-wheelers or wind ruining my audio. I don't have to stare into the sun, and the best part is, I don't have to stand out in the snow to bring you this video. It's pretty big for me to be involved with an organization like the Commemorative Air Force, so I want you viewers to come out, support this museum, and have some fun. Only bad things will happen if you don't. The B-25 Mitchell might just be the most recognizable medium bomber from World War II, maybe of all time. And although I did say the B-25 was simple in design, the medium bomber role was a lot more complicated than it sounds. On paper, you make a plane that's bigger than a fighter, but not quite airliner-sized, optimized for low-ish altitude, and bing, bang, boom. Yeah, easier said than done. In reality, this is basically the hardest possible approach to air combat. You're flying a big target with low speed, maneuverability, and defensive capability. You're also flying at an altitude that's either just high enough to be an easy target for AAA, or so low that a bad gust of wind would send you nose first through a few trees. Plus, if you're a military strategist, you gotta ask yourself honestly if it wouldn't be better to spread those resources out across multiple aircraft instead of just one. Right, so the job the Mitchell was built for was going to be a rough one right off the bat. I'd even go as far as to say medium bombing is more trouble than it's worth. Seems like a real high-risk, low-reward situation, but this is World War II we're talking about. If you weren't willing to flirt with death on the daily, you're giving the enemy an opportunity to get ahead. This war is for bold plays only, and walking into those dangerous missions would be one of the most simple, unassuming, and straightforward aircraft possible. I do bash the Mitchell's design a bit, but honestly, the flight performance was very nice, and it wasn't really due to the engines.
Engines?
Not yet, Jimbo. Not yet. The slight bend in the wings you see here, plus the double rudder, made flying the B-25 extremely easy. Obviously, very useful when flying missions low to the ground and or with a few hundred bullet holes in your plane. The Mitchell wasn't well armored, it was sturdy. Key difference there. Something armored deflects damage. Something sturdy takes the damage, but keeps going. Case in point, one B-25 from the Mediterranean that had the nickname Patches. One day, the crew chief decided not to repaint the repairs for the bullet holes the plane endured. By the end of the war, it had 400 holes patched with a disgusting yellow paint called zinc chromate. More impressively, in its 300-mission career, it had to belly land 6 times. All this damage warped the airframe so much that in order to fly in a straight line, the pilot had to yaw the plane 6 degrees to the right and roll the plane 8 degrees to the left, which makes it kind of look like it's gotten blackout drunk and is now stumbling around the sky about to throw up. Which makes sense, because remember, it's covered in a paint that looks like this. Yeah, I'd want to throw up too if I had that color painted on me. So you've got a durable fuselage riding on a pair of very reliable wings. So, what would you put on that fuselage? No, really, what weapons would you put on? Don't be shy, know our answers. In fact, I think the designers of the Mitchell thought the same thing, because there really isn't a standard armament for the B-25. It doesn't help that the B-25 isn't just called the B-25. That's what the Army Air Force called it, but the Mitchell was also used by the Navy, and they called it the PBJ-1. Anyways, for starters, the Mitchell...
Did you say PBJ? I'll take it from here. Right, so the PBJ, formerly known as the B-25, is the best variant of the Mitchell. This thing had a lot of great upgrades done that really overhauled it to fit both the needs of the Navy and become a devastating combat aircraft. The first thing they did, they painted it blue. Okay, did you get all that? It's modifications like that which truly make the PBJ the most advanced version of the aircraft. Getting the standard stuff out of the way first, PBJs as well as the inferior B-25s were equipped with two Wright R2600 twin Cyclone engines. Each engine could put out 1,700 horsepower. This lets you fly at a top speed of 263 knots, as high as 24,200 feet, and at a distance of 1,170 nautical miles. There were also a load of radars mounted in all sorts of ways on different variants. Alright, now if you haven't been listening, it's time to clock in, because I really don't want to repeat myself on this one. Basically every single... Oi! Are you listening? What'd I just say? I ain't repeating myself. Basically every Mitchell in service was using a different weapon setup. So instead of telling you what the standard armament layout was, I'm just going to list off everything this plane could carry. Now expecting you people to realize that they didn't carry all this stuff at the same time. Right, so the PBJ had it, could have... you see what I mean? Okay, the PBJ could have a tail gunner, nose gunner, waist gunners, a belly turret, and a top turret. Depending on the model, it could be found in either the front or the rear of the fuselage. Slightly more consistently seen are the 450 caliber gun pods mounted on both sides of the cockpit. You could also sometimes find one or two more forward-pointing 50 cals next to the bombardier. Or if you feel like the bombardier is a total nerd and you'd rather just leave him at home, you could go ahead and switch him and his workplace out entirely, and in its place install 8 50 cals. And if you feel machine guns are too wee for your liking, then get rid of 4 of them, and if you have a spare 75mm tank gun lying around, well, hot dog, you got no space to mount it. Now, guns are good, and when you got so many guns you could replace your co-pilot with a cannoneer, that's great. But that's just bullets at the end of the day, and bullets, well, they're your bread and butter, and as good as they are, what this PB&J needs is some meat with that butter. Let's talk explosives. What? Why are you looking at me like that? What, 'cause of the sandwich thing? Listen, don't knock it till you try it. Besides, this ain't a cooking show. Unless... No. I'm getting off topic. Our appetizer plate is 8 strips of bacon in the form of H-4 rockets mounted on the wings. If you're not a fan of guns in the nose, you can always try out the Vienna sausages, aka the twin automatic spin-stabilized rocket launchers, which can load a total of 10 rockets. You can never go wrong with the side dish of Parmesan chicken tenders. You can get them in a variety of sizes up to 3,000 pounds of free-fall bombs. We have a special tonight on Tiny Tim lamb chops. And finally, for the main dish, a glorious, well-seasoned, perfectly marinated, medium-rare steak. I'm talking about the Mark 13 torpedo mounted on the belly of our PBJ. And that's pretty much all you need to know about the specs on the Mitchell. Class dismissed. Go back to, Ryan. Or whoever. Go on now, get.
Stay classy, Jimbo. So what you probably... Hey, Jimbo. You do know my first name, right?
What? What kind of question is that?
Well, this is the 3rd time in a row you've gotten my name wrong. At first I thought it was a joke, but now I'm starting to wonder...
So it's not Ryan?
No.
Oh, right, I remember now. It rhymes with Ryan.
No.
Oh. Really?
Jimbo, how long have we known each other?
If I met you in... Oh my god. We've known each other for like a decade.
Yeah, a whole decade. And in that time, you've really not learned my name?
Well, in any case, pocket sand!
Anyway, you probably noticed that the flight performance numbers for the B-25 aren't nearly as impressive as the weapons selection. Well, I said it before and I'll say it again. Simple goes a long way. For Allies in many theaters of the war, it was very useful to have a large aircraft that could fly well at lower speeds to deliver ordnance to targets that were either too small, fast, or dug in to be effectively dealt with by strategic bombers. If you needed to bomb a railroad junction tucked away in the Italian mountains, the B-25 could get there. If U-boats were spotted near the British Isles, the Mitchell could quickly get rockets on target. Say the Russians needed an aircraft that can recon behind enemy lines. Well, for that mission, they kept their own planes at home. And when Marines started thinking about how nice it would be if the local Japanese cargo harbor was filled with 75mm holes, well. So I think I've made it pretty clear that the Mitchell is great at performing specialized attacks. But one mission stands above all others in this plane's history. A mission I would call the biggest wildcard play in United States history.
Guys, why aren't the brakes working?
Because I cut the brakes! Wild card, bitches! Yeah! What?
The Doolittle Raid is something I think could have only been possible in the era it came from. Technology was just good enough to make the idea work, and just not quite good enough for an alternate option to be available. All the mission needed was a few men with the audacity to see it through. Thankfully, the bombing of Pearl Harbor had provided plenty of men who fit that criteria. Basically 10 minutes after Pearl Harbor, America started thinking up ways to get revenge. President Franklin FDR Roosevelt proposed the very original idea of, let's do what they did to us to them. Now that sounds like the obvious, simple plan, but 3 key factors. 1. Franklin Delano President didn't just want to bomb some Japanese Navy base. He wanted the Japanese capital city. Now, as fun as it would be to slap Imperial Japan's ego in the face, mission failure means dead Americans washing up on Tokyo. Not a good first impression. 2. The Empire of Japan was scary. They did a lot of raping and pillaging. Not to mention the Navy is still tending to some pretty fresh wounds, so the idea of using aircraft carriers to attack Japan directly was kinda crazy. And what the Navy did have, well, remember that only 3 years prior, the US Navy started flying its first monoplane fighter. So, yeah, naval aviation tech wasn't really good yet. And 5. Naval bombers were not going to cut it for this mission. The best carrier bombers at the time were SPD Dauntlesses, and not only did they have a small payload, they only had a combat radius of about 250 miles. That's only like an hour's flight from the target. If you were a Japanese patrol aircraft, you would be able to see the carriers without losing sight of the mainland. There was no chance America was going to take their carriers that close to the Japanese mainland, much less wait around to recover the fighters. The only aircraft that would work were aircraft that were not designed for carriers. Now, this is where things go from unconventional to psychotic. The big idea came from JCS assistant Captain Francis Lowe. He worked at a naval air base that was shared with the Army, and on the runway, an outline of a carrier's deck was painted out for the Navy to practice with. And Captain Lowe noticed that the Army planes could pretty much take off within the painted lines. Enter the man of the hour, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy D here had to get some aircraft to fly 2,400 nautical miles with 2,000 pounds of bombs from the deck of a carrier and land safe. Doolittle chose the B-25 for its good takeoff characteristics and shorter wingspan over the competition. One thing about the B-25 though, it had never seen combat before. Gotta start somewhere. Might as well be the biggest spec ops mission ever, right? A test takeoff proved the mission was possible, and immediately volunteers were sought for the job. 24 crews were chosen, and they had about a month to train for the task. They took compressed courses in carrier takeoffs and night flying, while their planes were slowly modified to meet the demands of the mission. Despite a lot of time wasted on the ground due to maintenance, the Army pilots got relatively comfortable flying their modified planes in a carrier takeoff profile. Another thing Doolittle had to set up was a landing zone. He really wanted the Soviets to let them land in Vladivostok, even offering to give them the B-25s when they got there. But the Soviets had a neutrality pact with Japan, which they really didn't want to break since, well, they had bigger problems at the time. Eventually, a deal was made with China, and although it added 600 nautical miles to the trip, and available airstrips were dangerously close to the front line, they would at least have the chance to land and refuel. So let's take everything going on here and put this in a modern perspective. Imagine if we loaded a bunch of strategic bombers onto a Nimitz class. We tell the pilots, okay, you're going to use these planes that have never seen combat, take off from a carrier while you're loaded up with about 175% fuel at the expense of removing your electronics suite. But we're pretty sure you'll be fine. We practiced a bit. You're going to bomb the capital city of a country we just went to war with at night. We can't send fighter escort or refueling tankers because of the enemy air defenses. And you'll have to make a pit stop in conflicted territory. Also, don't get shot down because these guys are actual factual war criminals and they will not hesitate to chop your hands off. All right, have a nice flight. This type of thing doesn't happen anymore. These missions don't exist anymore. And the fact that people with a fraction of our modern technology went through with this mission is honestly just surreal. So 16 B-25s are loaded onto the USS Hornet and she sets off for Tokyo. The Hornet was basically a sitting duck if they got caught, by the way. The bombers couldn't be stored below deck or moved out of the way to let fighters take off. Meaning until the B-25s took off, the difference between a cargo barge and the USS Hornet was slim to none. It wasn't until the trip was more than half over they'd meet with the carrier Enterprise and her task force to keep them safe. Finally, the morning of the mission arrived, but tragedy struck. The Enterprise detected small ships in the distance. Turns out they were Japanese picket boats, and they had been reporting on the Americans. The escort fleet dealt with the ships, but command knew it was too late. Japan knew they were there. The element of surprise was gone. But there was a bigger problem. The Hornet was still 200 miles short of their planned launch site. Command had a hard call to make and little time to make it. They bit the bullet and decided to launch immediately. Weather was very unfavorable, to the point where even the giant Hornet was fighting the waves. The bombers were all crammed as far aft as the flight deck would allow, and the pilots would have to make do with what space they had. Being the proper leader he was, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle would be the first pilot to take off, and the one with the least amount of runway to use. If he could do it, surely the others could. Over the course of an hour, and with a few close calls on some takeoffs, amazingly, all of the Mitchells were safely airborne. Soon later, they split up. Most planes would not even see their comrades for the majority of their flight. 16 planes, 10 targets spread out across the Tokyo area and nearby cities. Each plane was armed with 4 bombs, 3 high explosive, and the 4th an incendiary bundle. All were successfully dropped on industrial facilities. The gunners even used their turrets to strafe targets of opportunity. A few fighters as well as some flak shells came up to defend Japan, but none managed to shoot down any of Doolittle's raiders. In fact, the Empire lost 3 of their fighters trying. For the Americans, the fight was short, but the struggle was going to stick around a while longer. Day became dusk, weather became foul, and the problems of poor communication were mounting. In addition to the threat of approaching Japanese forces, no one told the Chinese airfield crews where to point their homing beacons. They weren't even aware the bombers had taken off 10 hours early. In fact, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek asked to delay the arrival of the bombers so that his ground forces could secure the area. Meanwhile, in the sky, the status of the airstrips was starting to not matter at all. It seemed like they might not even stay airborne long enough to see shore before fuel ran dry. But in the last leg of the flight, the wind suddenly gave mercy in the form of a strong tailwind. It wasn't nearly enough for them to make it to any of the airstrips, but the crews at least had a coastline to bail out over. Except for one crew. Captain Edward York's aircraft was burning through fuel faster than normal, and he knew long before the others that he would not be making it to any Chinese airstrip. So he decided the consequences of attempting to refuel in Russia were probably better than turning his Mitchell into the Flying Dutchman. Flying Dutchman. Yeah, I know it's not very funny, is it? But anyway, please subscribe. So the good captain and crew found themselves washed up in Vladivostok, as we all do from time to time. And they were promptly arrested, as we all are from time to time. And in case their reasoning for doing so doesn't make sense to you, well, if declaring a fuel emergency was enough for Doolittle to bypass the consequences of violating the diplomacy of sovereign nations, he would have used that idea from the start. Now, it's not that the Soviet Union didn't want to help, but they more so didn't want to go to war with Japan. So in order to not be in violation of that neutrality pact, they were pretty much obligated to imprison Captain York, his crew, and his plane. It wasn't that bad for them, though. They weren't treated poorly or nothing, just a long, unpaid, non-scenic vacation. They just couldn't go home, otherwise that would be Russia helping America with the war against Japan, and Japan would have justification to invade them. About a year later, the prisoners were moved to a facility 20 miles from British-occupied Persia, at which point York bribed a smuggler to get them in the hands of the British, and they were able to get home. Rewinding back to the Raiders bailing out over China, as Doolittle gently floated down from the sky and landed in a pile of manure, yes, that's actually how he landed, it was probably about then the idea went through his mind, I'm probably getting court-martialed for this mission. In summary, the grand result of this mission was a great expense of resources from both the Navy and the Army, negligible damage to Japanese facilities, and a total loss of all aircraft. By modern standards, that would be an absolute embarrassment for the United States. There would be outrage at the military's total waste of taxpayer dollars and horrible strategy. And to be honest, literally speaking, kinda was.
Charlie, having somebody making wild decisions that make no sense, that benefits nobody.
Oh, yes. Right, yes. Is he listening to us? I can't tell.
He's listening. He's not understanding.
Yeah, he doesn't even, like, get us, man.
We're talking about you.
Okay, let's move on from
What
it.
do you think is happening right now?
Guys, it doesn't matter. It's
good.
Okay? You know, we'll sort this out later.
But, to Doolittle's surprise, he was not just welcomed back to the States, he was being celebrated. He got a 2-rank promotion, all of the crew members got their own Distinguished Flying Cross, and the home front was ecstatic. America had gotten sweet, sweet revenge on Japan, and for the rest of the war, they would be paranoid of threats to the mainland. And of course, paranoia is not a good mood for your citizens to be in when you're trying to be a tyrannical empire. In response, they did what any reasonable tyrannical empire would do and unleashed the Zhejiang Zhengji campaign, a simple retaliatory mission which, over the course of a few months, killed 250,000 civilians, which is more than both atomic bombs combined. Yeah, their thought process really was, in retaliation for a grand total of 64 bombs dropped on Japan by the Doolittle Raiders, who were retaliating Pearl Harbor, the correct reaction was to brutalize the Chinese civilian population, which, in addition to normal war crimes, included biological warfare, releasing cholera, typhoid, paratyphoid, and anthrax. They would also burn down entire towns just because they thought surviving Doolittle Raiders might have passed through the area. It really just goes to show the lengths tyrants will go through to harm the innocent and defenseless, and how the only thing capable of taking down a tyrant is bold action. And when you need to take action, remember that you don't always need a highly advanced, purpose-built device to get the job done. Sometimes you just need a simple tool. Not every sandwich needs to be a smorgasbord. Sometimes a simple PBJ will do just fine. So remember, treat your simple tools well, and they'll help you accomplish great things. Grape jelly is better than strawberry jelly, and from its first mission till its very last, the B-25 Mitchell has always been the king of bold plays. Okay, if you're still here watching, you are definitely required to go support this museum. You might have noticed that I haven't gotten to the story of Miss Mitchell here. Well, if I did that, you wouldn't have any reason to visit, now would you? But the people of the Commemorative Air Force Minnesota Wing would be more than happy to share it with you. So use these resources I've got here for you, go visit the museum, have a grand old time, smell the B-25, and remember, if everyone does this, nothing bad will ever happen again. All right, that's a wrap.